They will engage you. They're going to engage you. Yeah, as is customary, it's important to shout out your people. Firstly, shout out to the panel. Done a great job. You're here. Some of you are not here, so this is also an achievement in and of itself. I think secondly, it's important that we mention the contribution of our teammates. Shamiah has really done a lot. He was in this final last year, he didn't win. Hopefully this year we win, right? But even secondly, thirdly, actually, SDS family, Stratford Debate Society. I mean, we've done a lot. This whole bench, even some are still Stratford here, but you know, we still compete and you know, for the love of the sport. Yeah, like Becky mentioned, we share the stage with some of the great African, Kenyan. Oh, the suspenders. Oh yes, Masharia and Jabez for starting this culture. Hopefully we emulate and you know do well in this tournament. The persistence of extreme poverty panel in the global south is not attributable to random misfortune, but to a global economic order that systematically benefits the wealthy and disenfranchises the poor. The problem that exists in opening half, right, is the inability to recognize what exactly developing states look like. We tell you that a large proportion of these exist in global south states that have been the footstool upon which the developed states have used to derive the power that they currently have in status quo. The incentive then for these developing nations is to level this playing field for these states, such that this means then that they must pursue any means possible to alleviate themselves from this level of suffering. Notice this is particularly imperative in this debate panel because this was the tool that was actually used to entrench this power in the first place. They now have the means to reclaim this tool to be able to change this narrative, to change this power we win from closing government. But even more importantly, panel, very major question that must be responded to: what exactly exists as the relationship between developing and developed states in and of themselves? We tell you a couple of things from closing government. Firstly, there exists a relationship of exploitation of resources and domination of African human capital. You must recognize that historically slavery and colonization is something that existed and adhered for these states. That looks like, firstly, in principle, these people's human resources were actually taken away. But even secondly, the actualization and capitalization of African labor was a concept upon which a lot of these developed states rather were built upon. Notice that brain drain is something that is very live for these kind of people in and of themselves, and that is what led to the backs of the African backs, where Netherlands is, UK is, those very states that Becky and closing defend, that was built on African backs. Notice the import of this, particularly for Nolu in this debate, right, is that this debate allows us to have a powerful tool that can be used as an equalizer to level these playing fields for these developing nations. Secondly, unfair trade practices in here within status quo. This looks like the creations of doctrines such as protectionism and investment law that have now used as illegal, that have now then been used as protective mechanisms to protect illegally acquired capital in and of themselves. The legitimization of this, the impact of this then is that we have severe legitimization of these ill-acquired gains, and now Africans have a platform then to be able to utilize these kind of mechanisms to then take up these opportunities to correct this kind of narrative. The idea here is very simple, right? They erode state sovereignty in every pursuit, and it's legitimized through legal architecture to perpetuate the flow of goods and to perpetuate the flow of goods to benefit them in and of themselves. That means that African states are then trapped in a constant cycle of dependency. The very dependency that Becky is talking about actually adheres more and is more impactful in their world. But even thirdly, panel noticed that the Industrial Revolution was actually that was led up by these developed states, was actually part of the catalyst of the mess that we are in of this climate change in and of themselves. They use reduced carbon-intensive production that is responsible for this kind of thing. And since developing nations then were less of a contributor to the specific issue of this climate change, it is very unclear why we should trade off our economic advancement to deal with the very mess that you brought upon the entire world, not only affecting yourselves, but also affecting other African and developing nations in and of themselves. The import of this panel is that we should not trade off the urgency of this concern and the pursuit and the plight of these marginalized groups. But even panel noticed then that all of these things happen and they are gone. What happened then post-colonization? Two things. Firstly, Africa was turned into an exporter of our own raw materials and an importer of finished goods and that kind of thing from the very Western states that these people are interested in protecting. That means, firstly, Africans then lack these resources. Because of this level of monetary advancement, they cannot be able to capitalize on the resources that we produce in and of themselves internally. But even notice then, panel, that even if we buy them back and we admit, right, that they probably might be able to get them back, access is then impeded simply because these things are more costly. Meaning then that for a large majority of the people that exist within the global south, a lot of them cannot be able to access a lot of these goods and services that then they need to be able to propel their own socio-economic advancement that is vital for them in and of themselves. But even more importantly, notice then that Africa then became debt-ridden. Debt-riddenness led to three things. First, we are subjected to the power of the Western control. But even secondly, panel, we don't have enough power, economic power, to alleviate themselves from this suffering that OG really talks about. But even more importantly, panel, notice then that neocolonialism then becomes a very live concern in and of themselves, because the inability to actually have the monetary power to escape from this trap. The comparative that they force us to live in, panel, is that Africa then remains poor. Why? We don't have access to goods and services because of this cost. Two, we are reliant on this West simply because of the dependency syndrome that I already characterized you about. But even thirdly and most importantly, panel, Africa then becomes unlikely to catch up simply because this kind of tool is something that is very relevant, and that's something that's very important. The money that you can then get from these kind of things becomes very relevant to African states being able to change their narrative. But notice then, panel, that we must address a very specific concern. Notice the green future is not tomorrow, it's very far away. Examples to mechanize this. Firstly, the net zero dream is a very distant future. We have these resources today. We should capitalize on them today to be able to benefit us. But even, panel, if you buy that we can still do this thing in status quo, notice then that these things are incredibly expensive. Green tech and all of these kind of things require monetary backing. We don't have that power. You're telling us not to access this monetary power in and of themselves. But even thirdly, panel, a better response to this then becomes using the money that we then gathered from this kind of exploitation, we can then be able to engage in corrective mechanisms that exist. African countries such as Egypt has been able to do land reclamation, and sure why Becky's idea of farming is problematic in this debate, or it exists within this debate. But then secondly, we tell you that Netherlands has also done this kind of land reclamation mechanism that way. We address the feasibility concern when we tell you we have the ability to mine. We have very many powerful actors that exist in status quo, such as BRICS, that can be able to do this. External actors can then also be acquired, meaning that on net we still have funds which is necessary for Africans. But even more importantly, panel, Africa is able to leverage, use these kind of tools as bargaining power to leverage these kinds of things as a mechanism of geopolitical production in and of themselves, and potency of increasing the potency of African states. Notice then the argument becomes very simple. These obligations were entrenched by the West to maintain African states in status quo as a perpetual importer and tied to this level of dependency. Three analysis. Firstly, notice that with the info side is very clear that these goals are in conflict with each other. The very foundation of these goals was to equalize all people. The concern then is that not all of these goals should be achieved simultaneously. Let us prioritize what is more important then for the African people, what is more important for the developing nations. Then we can be able to address the climate change concern and its feasibility when we move into the future. But even more importantly, panel, the long-term and short-term concern clash that comes from opening, we still win it from closing government. When we tell you that the tools available to these people are present here and now. Op comparative is expensive. Op comparative requires deeper technology for us to be able to extrapolate this problem. Op comparative requires deeper knowledge. All of those things Africa doesn't have. We have the oil today. Let's use it as we can. CG.
Thank you, member of government. The member of opposition is about the second half of the opposition case.
First of all, my shout out goes to my partner, Michelle Adika, who's probably one of the best speakers on the continent and is an amazing person and an amazing friend. Also shout out to the SDS family and everyone else here in the final. You guys are amazing speakers. And shout out to the panel and Olympia guys for inviting us here and giving us an amazing experience. Here goes. So 3, 2, 1. I think the problem with developing countries is their inability to focus on the future. These people feel that they can catch up with the wrongs of the past, and they feel that they have a certain greater obligation towards fixing the wrongs of the past than leveling the playing field for the future. I think that's incredibly heinous and something very stupid to say in this debate. I think it's very harmful for you to say that you can use oil and gas as a catalyst to be able to compete with the developing world. Those people, the developed world, those people already have a fast mover advantage. There's a great power imbalance. You guys don't have the capacity to do this in the first place. 3 extensions then that I'm going to proffer in this speech. The first reason is as to why this is a very important and strategic move for developing countries. The second extension is on why this is likely to lead to ostracization by developed countries and why that's much more harmful than any of the benefits that you're likely to derive from opening government. The last extension is on why you will eventually need to go sustainable and why this is extremely harmful for you. This will address a lot of what closing government are lying to us here about. The first reason on why it's a strategic move for you in this important, you need to understand the history of how industrialization has happened in the first place. These countries had a lot of access to resources, they had a lot of weapons, the ability to be able to go out into other countries, commit colonization and be able to get slaves and all of those things. They had a lot of access to education, information, things that developing countries did not have access to. Now developing countries have access to internet. Now developing countries have a certain level of political consciousness that exists within these countries that allows them to be able to have a certain level of capacity for them to be able to industrialize and that sort of thing. So for the first time, developing countries finally have a level playing field in a specific niche industry where it's sustainable, where they can be able to develop sustainably. They don't have a level playing field in oil and gas. Why is this extremely important in this debate? Firstly, these developing countries and their citizenry have access to a lot of information. They can be able to derive this from the internet and a lot of these places. The second thing, and this is very important, the vast majority of the world is very peaceful right now. Wars of conquest don't exist. People don't have weapons and nuclear weapons and that sort of thing. So they just can't come to your country and steal your oil and gas. These people are not just as malevolent as they were 50 years ago. That thing then is there's just much more money to go around in the world today, more capital, private equity, those sorts of things. People are looking for where to invest. They are thinking of the future. They're not thinking of the past about oil and gas and that sort of thing. Lastly then is on just the ability of developing countries and just how much political consciousness they exist within those countries and that sort of thing. People are rational enough to draw a distinction and know that oil won't be there for the future. People are already moving to EVs and that sort of thing. This is important because it addresses the future and the ability of our developing countries to be able to have a strategic advantage over every other country that exists in the world today. Why is this more beneficial than all of these reparations that you're able to get, your ability to fix past harm, and your ability to make money from all of these things? The first reason, firstly, is that it's a very strategic move. You already have an industry where you can thrive in the future because you have access to a lot of the resources that can be able to make sure you're able to derive some level of political benefit from that sort of thing. You don't just want to be a developing country forever. You eventually want to become a developed country in the future. You need to think about the future and your ability to be able to live in a sustainable future. The second thing, and this is very important, your ability to have political clout in the world and to be able to influence change, to be strategically aligned towards what you need to do. You lose a lot of that when you go into prioritizing oil and gas and that sort of thing. We'll go into that more in our second extension. Lastly is on the economic benefit of it all. Oil and gas is extremely difficult to develop. OG proffer to you as to how you will need capacity and all of those things. They make a lot of assumptions in into this debate as to how you can be able to develop those sorts of things. We think sustainable development is much more efficient, much more easier to do. Population buy-in is much easier for you, so it's much more politically viable for you and politicians around the country. It's much better for you as a country. The second thing around why it's more strategic for you as a country is that the prospects of the future for oil and gas are not that good. The vast majority of the world already knows this. People are much more politically conscious these days. They know the detrimental effects of climate change and why that's likely to be harmful for them. The vast majority of the developed world is already moving away from oil and gas. So maybe they are using it today. Maybe Saudi Arabia is using oil and gas today, but in 50 or 60 years' time, they won't be using it. Why is this extremely harmful for you to prioritize oil and gas as a developing country? Firstly, it retrogresses you. So you'll eventually need to go into oil and gas. But now you don't have that advantage because you went back when everyone was going forward. You make the same mistake you made during colonialism where you didn't have capacity. And now you have the capacity to be able to move forward and have a certain level playing field with those developing countries. What does this mean? Any benefit that you get as a nation is likely to be short-lived. So you return the country back to where it was in the past. Why is this bad? You're essentially retrogressing the country. Before I go into my third extension, I'll be closing.
Notice that a lot of what you're talking about is contingent on capacity to be able to do, which is monetary in nature. To suddenly gain monetary power, how do you solve this problem? How do you move into the system with no money?
This is the same problem that Opening have. They just believe that just because you discovered oil and gas, you just suddenly wake up and have some monetary benefit from that. I think Open already sufficiently responded to this, showing why there exist monopolies like Okech and that sort of thing. But also, secondly, there's not a lot of political clout around the country, around the world that makes people want to move towards the oil and gas and that sort of thing. Second extension as to why this is likely to cause ostracization for you in developing countries. You need to understand that this is a highly isolationist policies. Developing countries, once they move towards oil and gas, are likely towards being isolated in the world. Firstly, economies in the world are highly tightly integrated. They lose a lot of trade deals and that sort of thing. But also the power imbalance that exists inside the world in this place, which means then that you don't have the same luxury to be able to commit mistakes like pursuing oil and gas that larger countries and more powerful countries are likely to have. Why is it likely to lead to more ostracization for you? Firstly, countries are already moving towards sustainable development. This is much harmful for you. Public sentiment within and also outside of your own country. People are much more politically conscious of what their countries and governments are doing. This is likely to lead to much more backlash for you. Things like you having sanctions and that sort of thing, you need to align to yourself to better players. Why is this far much worse than the benefits you are able to derive from a lot of the government case? Firstly, the level of clapback you're able to get from a lot of these developing countries is likely to be much harmful for you in other industries like agriculture, like trade deals, like your ability to be able to build standard gauge railways within your own country and that sort of thing. But also, secondly, you lose buy-in from other developing nations that want to pursue sustainable development means. So your ability to be able to form coalitions and clout around the country within places like even the United Nations is severely limited and that sort of thing. Thirdly, you lose the moral high ground that already exists for developing countries, because as they proffer to you, developing countries do not have that responsibility for climate change. So those benefits that you're able to derive, like you don't have to sell carbon credits and that sort of thing, the Kyoto Protocol and all of those things that highly favor developing countries, you lose all of those things, and I think that's extremely harmful for you. So these harms are highly self-propagating. They retrogress these countries. Last thing then on why this is likely to be harmful for the future prospects of your country. Eventually, you will need to go sustainable in the future. The prospects of oil and gas are likely going to be diminished within the next 15 to 20 years. You lose a lot of that internal political pressure because a lot of your own population is highly politically conscious of the harmful effects of oil and gas. Why is this bad? Once a developing country discovers oil and gas, that is what all political capital is directed to. Those people are highly dependent on that. They lose the ability to rebuild capacity, and they all eventually have to retrain their own populations or proud to oppose.
And also the government whip to approve the government case of Olympia.
All right, in the spirit of shout outs, I think I want to begin by thanking God for being here. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so in the spirit of shout outs, I want to thank God for being here. It's quite important. My family for the logistic supports. Mashari and Juguna as well, emotionally, Ali, physically. He's been there for me as a mentor, and it's really amazing. To everyone in the panel as well, I've learned so much from most of you, which is really amazing. So thank you so much. To the SDS family, you guys are just amazing, and I grow every time because of constantly going against people like Becky, Adika, Trudeau, and Jeff. So it's really, really amazing. The Kenyan family as well. So much congrats to all of you, and to everyone who's made this possible. Here we go. Also, I'm back-to-back finalist, so I guess that means something. Yeah. So let's go. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Takura, the developing countries in the global south remain haunted by a specter which is the past, characterized by the oppression and domination of our grandparents. Jeff gives you a historical account on 5 different layers that proves why not only we must prioritize this, but that the problems which are experienced in Africa are as a direct result of those giving us this obligation within today's debate. Jeff says that this is because of 5 major things. Firstly, on colonization, exploitation of resources, and the domination of human capital within Africa. What this meant is that Africa fell slightly behind the West. Again, those who are giving us those obligations. But secondly, the existence of all these practices, the doctrine of protectionism and all that, which then gave them a platform to defend their illegally acquired capital. Thirdly, on the Industrial Revolution and how they polluted even on behalf of Africa. So majority of their capital is premised on the pollution that even affects Africa to today. What's worse about this is Becky's own concession that she cares nothing about what we say about the West in today's debate. So she doesn't care whether these obligations equally accrue to the West, who are the same people who polluted and continue to become the biggest polluters in today's debate. But the fourth thing Jeff then says is that Africans were condemned to become primary importers, and later on they become stuck in the debt crisis, and this is bad. What are the impacts of these arguments? He proves 3 things. A, why we need to write the African story, that we are not just meant to be the global poor and that sort of thing. Secondly, why there's a need for Africans to prioritize the reparation and the emancipation of their own people. And thirdly, why we cannot at any instance allow for the West to determine the obligations that accrue to African people. The second defense I'm then going to make is, even if we are vulnerable, why is it justified? A, we think the impacts of climate change are, as Joshua concedes, irreversible. But secondly, Africa is not in a position to change the status of climate change in and of itself. Why is this the case? Understand that the biggest polluters in and of themselves are within the West through things like Industrial Revolution and the countless huge companies which exist on their side, and the tricky lifestyle which exists on the West as well. What it then means, even if we stop today, we are unlikely to solve the problems that these guys want us to solve. But secondly, you need to understand that the most proximate solution within today's debate towards being able to solve the problem is contingent on the development of green technology. The problem with green technology is that both sides argue it is expensive and requires so much dependence on the West to be able to just emancipate us from all these problems. This is something we are ready and willing to do to the extent where we are able to do this. But this is contingent on us being able to prove feasibility. How do we prove feasibility? Jeff gives 3 mechanisms. A, Africa can mine. Look at situations on things like oil in Uganda or oil in Turkana in Kenya in and of itself. It doesn't mean that we are always going to become dependent on the West, especially because of infrastructural projects by institutions like the BRICS have made it particularly easy for us to access these benefits. But secondly, even if external actors come in, as these guys argue, we think that's a marginal impact on our side because we're able to get money. We don't think why that's a bad thing. But thirdly, even if this is not the case completely, we think we are able to leverage bargaining power, which is literally a good thing, to the extent where you can threaten to withhold the oil market in and of itself is something which is good. But it's not only oil. So many impacts, or rather so many minerals are within Africa, things like aluminium, cobalt. These guys cannot win. But what's the comparative? 5 things. A, Africa remains poor because we ignore the minerals, which is our strong point, and move to climate change. 2, climate change in and of itself is expensive, so we have to depend on the West. 3, there's lower yield and production because now we are depending on things which are very expensive and we cannot access them. 4, they sit on the minerals which exist within Africa. We think that's bad. 5, what it inherently means is that we are unlikely to catch up with the West. We become debt-ridden, and this exactly brings to life the whole situation of Western sovereignty. Let me begin with CO and take CO out of the debate. They have no exclusive extension. A, on ostracization, we're ready to buy the bullet from CG and say it's fine. We're okay with the biggest polluters in the world literally ostracizing us for taking their own way. It's not a big thing within the debate, to the extent where they don't care about us. They've literally literally like polluted on our behalf. They've colonized us, they've exploited all these things. We don't care why the biggest impact has to be, why we should care about why they should cancel us or something of the sort. But two, this is not true, because you need to understand that the BRICS recently allowed people like Saudi Arabia and Iran to join the BRICS. Why this is the case? There's so much value in having minerals in your country. This is why they allow these countries to inherently enter the BRICS to the extent where they value the minerals which these guys are able to bring. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and all those. It's not true that you're going to get ostracized by the international community. The second thing they argue is on strategic aid. But one thing you need to understand is that in and of itself, Africa is not thriving in like farming and all those agriculture nonsense. This is what these guys want you to believe. Two mechanisms. Follow me on this. A, there is so much hunger which is within Africa as a result of drought. Look at the Horn of Africa and that sort of thing. Which is why you can't allow these guys to say that agriculture is our biggest stronghold. There's so many climate problems which occur within Africa. But secondly, this is a very exclusive mechanism. Most of Africans are youths, and what then with youth is that most of these individuals are very highly educated. What this then means is that we are not within the illiteracy which occurred in the initial days, which allowed you to preference for things like agriculture. What this then means is that more and more people are moving out of agriculture. Look at why Nika prefers to have an online job in status quo as compared to just go and farm. What this must prove to you, A, is that the social value of agriculture has gone down even within Africa. Two, that most of the youths prefer things like technology. And three, that most of these individuals are educated. They preference having white collar jobs and that sort of thing. Shoot.
Okay, there's alternatives to work, for example, Ukraine, and example that most developed nations have switched to, but there's no alternative to food, which means there will always be consistent demand for food in both worlds. Right?
Let me start with that. So they say the food problem. I think Jeff already characterized to you A, on how Netherlands and countries like Egypt have been able to reclaim lands which had initially been taken and overcome by things like sea. But two, you can be able to access GMOs on our side of the house as well. So in the worst case where they say, oh, you're going to have drought, we're still able to access all these benefits. But three, we're very okay with Africa moving from a place of agriculture to a place of industrialization in and of itself. We think that's particularly beneficial, especially because of the mechanisms on why people preference moving out of agriculture into more beneficial fields. Two, these guys say there's no comparative advantage in resources. This is untrue, especially because of the inflation which occurs within status quo. What happens in status quo is because of the monopolization of OPEC or the geopolitical interests. So things like the Russian-Ukraine war, they affect the oil prices. What it then means is that having anyone additional within the market is something which is likely to make you valuable. Why? Because the prices then become stable and you're able to just neutralize the whole thing they talk to you about comparative advantage. But two, even if you buy the idea on comparative advantage, we still think that the extent that you're able to have this oil within Africa internally is good. Why? Because the people within those areas are able to access, or rather able to access cheaper oil, which means that most of the other products are going to be cheap. So at best, even if you're not able to solve, we think having it internally in Africa is a good thing because you make other things become cheaper. We think it's not contingent on the idea that you have to sell it. Here.
The opposition would conclude this final. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah, I'm happy to be here. It's been extremely exhausting trying to get to this point. It's been so uncertain and so like you've been getting anxious about it. So I'm just happy that we've gotten here. Extremely grateful to Trudeau. He's not only a great friend and like just emotionally supportive, but he's also a really, really intelligent person, a great partner with great ideas. And I think I'm really happy to have partnered him. Grateful to the entire SDS like family. We came here, we've done our best, and hopefully we can go back home with a trophy. Yeah, okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. the baby in opening government's world is going to survive today, but will for sure die tomorrow. I think the problem with teams in this debate is that all their cases are hinged on solvency that none of them prove. CG say you're going to solve the idea that like these countries are suddenly going to become more powerful and they're going to rank above USA, but they don't show how that's going to happen. OO say the most important thing is agriculture and food, but they don't show how one developing country is going to solve the climate change crisis. I'm not really sure about OG. We think at the point where we're able to show you that we don't necessarily rely on this solvency that no team is able to prove within this debate, then that becomes something that's valuable. Distinguishing from OO, because it's lazy for Shamiah to say we had no extension. I don't think he was listening to Trudeau. We think a couple of like things that we do differently. Like I said, OO's case is hinged on proving that a developing country can protect its people, can fix agriculture, and suddenly the climate change crisis is resolved. But we think our case is different. We think we are never hinged on fixing this climate change. All we are trying to show you is that this sustainable development is good enough for this economy, and it's something that they ought to do because this is a strategic moment to do this. We think he's clear in terms of like how you have a fast mover advantage in this regard because no other country is moving towards this, and if you move towards it like at a hyper rate, we think that's something that's likely to give you more advantage. We tell you this is things like geothermal, this is things like water, this is things like solar, not necessarily as difficult in terms of like capacity as gov teams try to fiat, but they don't necessarily prove to us. But even if we require like some form of like foreign investment, you're only likely to get that in our world because both sides of the world, this is a developing country that's always going to need international support, always going to need to like trade with other like international countries. At the point where we're able to prove to you that this can only occur in our side of the world, that becomes something that's valuable. The other thing Trudeau talks to you about is this international support and why it's significant. Because no gov team proves to us that oil and gas is going to suddenly make you the most powerful country. It's the only thing that your economy depends on, and you're suddenly going to overtake everyone. We think there's other facets of your economy like trade and investment that heavily rely on like international support. At the point where you get that clapback, it becomes something that bad. They can't say you won't get clapback because these powerful countries are like also using carbon. We think it's far much worse for you. We think Uganda still face clapback because of their bill, regardless of the fact that like places like UAE and Saudi Arabia still enforce the same things. They are going to take the opportunity to sanction you because you don't have that same power dynamic to clap back against them. We think it's far much worse. It's going to hurt you far much more. We don't think that's valuable. We think that's something that's important. The last thing he talks to you about is the fact that you're eventually going to have to go sustainable, which I don't think any gov team accepts within this debate. These like resources are eventually going to deplete, and even if they don't deplete, there's going to be immense pressure from the international community. Everyone is afraid of dying. Everyone wants to move towards green energy. You're eventually going to have to move towards that. It's far much worse in their world because then you have to rebuild industries. You have to change from like using coal industries to trying to build other industries. You have to retrain your people, like Trudeau said, to now learn to work with like solar because they never learned this in school. They were learning how to like deal with coal and oil, things that are depleting. We think that's harmful. Even the youth that CG talks about now don't even have like a vast like employment opportunities, which we don't think is something that's valuable. We think opening government says the first thing that like countries don't mean what they say, and that's something that's like bad because they'll never do like what they say. It's the idea of like developed countries and stuff like that. We think the important thing to note here is that this is a developing country with no bargaining power and not at the same level as those higher countries. So they don't have the capacity to do bad things just because other bigger actors are doing bad things. USA can do whatever they want to do, but they won't face clapback because they have that power. You don't have that power. They'll sanction you. They'll take this opportunity to bring you to the ground because the international community generally has agreed we are afraid of death and we are afraid of crisis. You don't have the ability to take this action. We think that's bad. We think the harm of this international clapback is far much worse. This sanction mean all the money they get from oil and gas are likely going to be used to mitigate the effects of those sanctions, the investment and like international aid that you'd otherwise require for your people, because this is not the only industry. You need to trade with other countries, and we think that's something that's just not valuable to this like specific world. The other thing they talk about is the best thing we can do is mitigate climate change. I think this just doesn't make sense. A lot of the harms are like irreversible. A lot of things are like tipping change, things like biodiversity, things like ocean acidity and stuff like that. We don't necessarily think this is something that's true, that you can reverse these harms. But even if it's true, it means all the money you get from mining that oil is going to be reinvested in mitigating the effects of climate change. So you never really reap utility from it at the end of the day. Your people never get this money and never get food on their table. We think that's harmful. We think that's bad. We think this technology itself is expensive. Things like cloud seeding, trying to fix climate change. We don't think that's something they can say exists within this debate. The other thing they say is there's no alternative. alternatives. Well, they kind of fear there's no alternatives, but we tell you, investing within like just sustainable development is not that expensive. It's probably things that are natural to your land, things like solar, things like water, things like compost heaps at your home so that you don't have to like buy petrol and put petroleum gas and stuff like that. These are things that people can do and that are far much easier. But even if they aren't, both sides are going to need investment. In our world, at least if you get investment, it's in investing in something that you can eventually not need that, like you have like foreign investment in that specific area and you'll eventually not need them, because these are technologies that are going to like you're probably going to have them for like prolonged periods of time, as compared to the oil and gas that's eventually going to deplete. The dependency that CG cares about is not necessarily something that's exclusive. Now engaging CG. Their case is principle. This is not a principle debate. We think it's about people surviving and people not dying. But secondly, the idea that you need to change power and you need to become the most powerful, well, I think it's flashy, I think it's cool, I think we are tired of like being like held down, but they don't prove how they are able to like just have this power dynamic change at the end of the day. You have no capacity to compete. You have actors that had a first mover advantage that have been mining this oil for years, and I think that's something that's bad. You can probably never have that same capacity that they would. We think Trudeau's extension responds to this, because he tells you why it's a strategic movement to move into sustainable like energy, because these other countries, you don't have like as much time in terms of like advantage as they had with like things like oil and like fossil fuels. At the point where they aren't moving into these things, it's strategic for you to do it now. It's strategic for you to use the money they give you through investment and stuff like that to develop an economy that they otherwise aren't doing. You can't compete with them on oil if they've done this for 200 years. The other thing they try to talk about is how capacity in our world is worse than theirs. We think we just agree that investment is needed in both sides of the world. The difference between investment in our world is you eventually won't need it, because these are industries that will eventually become sustainable and not require you to keep pumping money in. In their world, at best, that oil and gas will end. You still need MNCs to bring you the technology to develop those things. We think that's something that's not valuable. We agree dependency is bad, but at least we eventually show you how you can grow and develop. That's something that's valuable. Proud to oppose.
Thank you everyone for the debate, and we will cover it and the rest of the call.